It starts with a gruesome murder in the most famous museum in the world. From there, an epic tale unfolds. Secret societies are exposed, religion is rewritten, and our very notion of Jesus is questioned. It's an historical whodunit that's captivated the world and caused much debate over just what is fact and what is fiction.
I began as a skeptic. As I started researching Da Vinci Code, I really thought I would disprove a lot of this theory about Mary Magdalene and holy blood and all of that. I became a believer.
Since the Da Vinci Code first appeared, the reclusive Dan Brown has said very little about his book. So I set out to unravel its mysteries. A journey that would take me to 2 continents and 3 countries.
That was a new segment about the Da Vinci Code, a book that was popular about 10, 15 years ago. How many of y'all have read Da Vinci Code? Okay, let's pray for these people. Just kidding, I also have read the Da Vinci Code. So that's a legend that was actually 300 years old, started by the atheist Voltaire 300 years before, and Dan Brown, the author, kind of made it popular. And we'll get back to that. So we're in a series called Text Message. We're coming to the end of that series. Next week we'll finish it. But last time we talked about this library of books and the second shelf, the New Testament, and we talked about the letters that are in your New Testament and how strange it is. It's not in any other what's considered sacred or holy books, letters. And it's a little bit confusing to you because today we're going to talk about the Gospels, and it's confusing to you because in your library, the way it was handed to you, the Gospels come first and then the letters, but that's actually not the way it was happened in history. Because within a couple of decades, these Christian communities existed all around the world, and these apostles, people commissioned by King Jesus, were writing letters back to those churches. And a couple of decades after those letters were written, the Gospels were written. And so a good principle of reading this library well is to remember the Gospels were the last thing written. And since they're central, there's 4 of them, you should read the rest of the letters, and in fact, the rest of the whole library through the lens of what we call gospel, which is just a word that means good news. And it is a biography about Jesus. Okay, so let me start here. In August of 70 AD, something very important happened that we don't really learn about in school. It was the beginning of what is called the First Jewish War. It started off in little bitty revolts. Jewish people were tired of the Roman soldiers occupying Israel, but Rome really needed to control this area of the world because it was a major export of bread in the world. And Rome tolerated the rebellion for a while, but eventually they had enough. And so they sent their biggest general, General Vespasian, in to crush the revolt. But the Roman zealots, what we would consider, or the Jewish zealots, what we would call terrorists today, banded together and they fought back against Rome. And miracle of miracles, for years, they were actually able to stand off against the biggest military in the world. For 4 years, Rome, they shut down the city of Jerusalem where no one could get in or out. But for 4 years, they kept the Roman soldiers out. And it was such a big deal to the Jewish zealots that they commemorated coins. You can still find these coins today. Year 1 is what they put on the coins. General Vespasian, for months, tried to break into Jerusalem, but they held him off, and eventually he was called back to Rome, and he was made emperor. And because the time he was made emperor, Rome was pretty divided, he knew that they needed a big military victory to unite all of Rome. So he sent his best, he sent his son, Titus, to go and squash all the rebellion and ultimately eradicate all of Israel. But Titus couldn't do it. For 2.5 years, they held Israel in siege, but they could not break in. Soldiers had been out there for 2.5 years. And listen, if you haven't been to Israel, I've been to Israel in the summer, and in the summer, we call it the Holy Land, but in the summer, it is as hot as not holy. It's hot in the summer, it snows in the winter. These soldiers were miserable for 2.5 years. Every time they would catch a Jew outside of Israel or outside of Jerusalem, they would crucify him to show the rest of the Israelites what was awaiting them. And after 2.5 years, they could have waited for the population to die out, but that was not why Vespasian sent them. He sent them to make a point. So they built a ditch 43 miles around the city of Jerusalem, and then they built a ramp to break in. And late in April 70 AD, even while hundreds are dying of hunger and thirst, Titus rallies the soldiers and they storm into Jerusalem and they destroy everything, especially the temple. He made sure there was not a stone left on another one except for one small corner where he wanted to leave it up to show the world how big the temple was that he had absolutely destroyed. Today it is known in Israel as the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. Titus gave orders to raze every single part of the city so that no one would even remember the name Jerusalem. And he killed almost everybody except a few people that he considered their best and brightest that they could use as slaves in Rome. And he brought them all back along with the artifacts from the temple, like the menorah, the candle, their showbread, their supreme symbol, the Torah, the first few books of this library. And he marched them through the city of Rome to show everybody just how soundly he had defeated Israel and what happens when any part of the world messes with Rome. But the fact that he destroyed their temple, the fact that he brought back their sacred artifacts was meant to show a point. This was not just one group of people defeating another group of people. This was Rome defeating their God. And Vespasian, normally when Rome took over another country, they would allow them to worship their God still, but not with this group of rebels. He wouldn't even let them do that. In fact, every year, every Jew around the world, no matter how loyal they had or had not been to Rome, was forced to pay 2 drachmas, a temple tax, to the god, or to the temple of Jupiter, a pagan god. The exact same tax they used to pay to the temple of Yahweh. The point was hard to miss. All of Palestine became Vespasian's personal property, and by the year 135 AD, the name Jerusalem stopped existing in all official documents. And what that means is that by the year 70 AD, Judaism, as it had been for thousands of years, stopped existing. The temple was where God was said to live. And they took that entire thing apart. And 1,500 miles away from Jerusalem, when Titus brought back all the spoils of war and the people who had now been forced into slavery, as he marched them through the streets of Rome, they decided to commemorate this great military victory with something that is in Rome still standing today. It's known as the Arch of Titus. If you've been to Rome, you've seen this. And close up, there is a relief that describes that story I just told you. You can see the menorah, you can see the sacred objects as they're reminding people, this is what happens when you mess with Rome. Now, why in the world would I tell you that long, sad, horrible story? Because around this time, everything has fallen apart. There is a young Jewish man named John Mark who takes up his quill and writes in Greek, not in Hebrew, the language of God, not in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, but in Greek, the language of the victors. This is the beginning of the Messiah, the good news of Jesus, the King. And that story I just told you is a really big deal in the first century when this second shelf was being written. Mark was the first gospel written, and it was written either right before this happened, which makes Jesus' prediction about the temple being destroyed in Mark all the more powerful, or it was written right after it, but it was so early, they hadn't had any time to reflect on what does this mean. Mark's the earliest gospel written, so there's no infancy narrative. There's very little about Jesus' resurrection. In fact, all there is the tomb is empty, the angels tell them. The tomb is empty, go and tell the disciples. Jesus is crucified, his body is placed in a tomb, and a few days later the tomb is empty. It was the first gospel to be written, and it was written in a certain time and place with people who had shared life with Jesus. And this is important because of the way history works. I know a preacher who was in seminary several decades ago in the 70s, and his seminary professor told them in the 70s, this is the way history works. You watch, within a few years, there will begin to be a rumor that circulates that the Holocaust didn't really happen. And back in the 70s, people were like, what? How could anybody ever think that? The Holocaust is so widely known and documented and accepted as a historical fact. I mean, it just happened. And the seminary professor said, well, you watch. Because as soon as the eyewitnesses to that event start to die off, there will be challenges to that actually happening. This is why Dwight Eisenhower actually went to concentration camps. Dwight Eisenhower went and carefully documented what he saw for posterity, for future generations to know. This is real. This really happened. We cannot forget it. And just like that, these 4 stories, these 4 biographies in your second shelf of your Bible are doing that with Jesus' life. For the other people in the world who didn't have the access to living in Palestine, to knowing all these stories. This is important because when we talk about the Bible, at least the way I grew up, so much about the talk about the Bible was believing in the Bible. And that's great, as long as you know that's not the end. The Bible's not that interested in you just believing in the Bible. The Bible is telling a story of God's activity in history. These stories really happened. There's legitimately good historical reasons to believe they really happened. The Bible is a collection of books, and it's never just trying to get us to believe in the Bible. It's trying to tell a story to get us to the heart of God and to believe in Jesus. Most of the New Testament, in fact, I think all of the New Testament was written when people who had interacted with the resurrected Jesus were still alive. And for me, this is so significant because these people died for this story. There's, the silly stuff in the Da Vinci Code of, people, it's the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas that really the church suppressed. That's the dumbest thing. I don't know if that's a polite way to say that, but let me say it this way. In the first century, people were not being killed for carrying around the Gospel of Thomas. You were killed for carrying around the Gospel of Luke because they knew what that meant. They knew what that story said. There is another king other than Caesar? That's actually in the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts. That'll get you killed. These men and women died not for what they believed. And this is a big distinction because, I grew up in my 20s, I saw planes fly into Twin Towers, just like a lot of you. A lot of people die for what they believe. These people did not die for what they believed. They died saying, we had breakfast with that guy you killed. After you killed him, by the way. They died saying that. These men and women died not for what they believed, but for what they had seen, touched, tasted. They believe, and here's the thing. You can think it's made up, but it is it's an anomaly in history that people would die for a lie. So John Mark sits down and writes this, the beginning of the gospel, the good news about Jesus the Christ. And he creates this, what is a literary genre, a brand new literary genre we know as gospel. It's all about the life, the death, the resurrection, the ministry of Jesus. There is no hint in Christianity that in your New Testament that the Christian religion is based on spiritual principles or ethics, unlike all the other world religions. It's actually based on the person and work of a real human being. Ideas are not crucified. Real human beings are. Our problem with the Bible, a lot of it is the way it's presented to us, right? And it was good intention. It happened to me. I've done it with my kids. We you get handed the Bible and it's all mapped and wrapped and it's like, well, this is a book and it's more than a book, right? And you open your Bible and you're like, well, it's all kind of equally important, right? Has it ever dawned on us? There is one creation story in here. There's one story of Noah and the flood. There's one story of David and Goliath or the Exodus story. But when it comes to Jesus, there's 4 of them. There's 4 gospels. Why so much about Jesus? Well, it's because not everything is equally important in this. The center of it all. When the first century was happening, they knew this is something that splits history in half. Something new has happened, something that totally eclipses the significance of all the stuff that's happened before. In fact, all the stuff that's happened before has to be read in light of what that happened. This is the crux of the matter. Listen, if you're struggling with your faith, here's something. Christianity does not rise or fall on whether the Exodus did or did not happen. It did, by the way. Christianity does not rise or fall on whether King David was a historical person. He was, by the way. It doesn't rise or fall on whether Adam and Eve were a historical couple. Probably so, by the way. It rises or falls on whether Jesus is who he says he is, did the stuff he said he did, and lived and died the way and rose again the way the New Testament says. And so I want to show you today why I think you can trust, why I trust the New Testament as telling accurate historical stuff. And it's not a security footage. It's not a police report. They were writing according to the historical standards of their day. First off, these biographies, there's Matthew, John. That's right. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you are making this up as propaganda, you're not good at propaganda. A couple of things. Mark. You know what Mark is known for? He's known for being the guy who splits up the first pair of missionaries. And you know how I know that? It's in your New Testament. Mark is the guy who splits up Paul and Barnabas. He abandons them. Paul doesn't want to have anything to do with them. Barnabas does, and so they split up. That's what he's known for. If you're looking for someone credible, if you're in a room and you're like, all right, who's going to write about Jesus? You'd be like, Mark, you should sit this one out, actually. You don't have a great track record. Luke? What is Luke known for? Nothing. He's known for being Paul's traveling companion, and that's it. If you're making these up and attaching names to them, why would you attach them? Matthew is a tax collector. Of all the disciples you want to hear from, you'd be like Judas, then Matthew, everybody else before then, right? John is the only one who is an eyewitness, who has credibility to it. And the authors of these 4 Gospels are writing their accounts in different countries. Do you know that? They're not writing from Jerusalem, which adds a layer of this, because they're writing from Greece and Italy and Turkey. And so there's a lot of things you can check to see, is this accurate? So, for example, names. Back in 2004, a scholar did some really careful work on the difference between Jewish people's names in Jerusalem and then like Jewish people who lived in like Egypt at this time and Jewish people that lived in like Syria and the surrounding nations. And there's a distinct difference in what those names were. So you know this, like if you're pregnant with child right now, you're probably thinking a lot about what to name your kid. You know, if you name your kid Adolf Herod, it's probably not going to go well in their life. So you choose your names well. And you want to be unique. You don't want to be like everybody else. But like everybody else, when you pick your kid's name, a decade later, it's going to be like one of the most popular names of that year. It's just the way it works. They're popular names. And those are regionally based. And the New Testament, the Gospels, reflect accurately the names of the men and women that lived in Jerusalem at that time. Not in Egypt, the Jewish people that lived in Egypt, not the Jewish people that lived in Syria. This is actually a really big deal. Statistically speaking, it's pretty improbable they would have gotten that right as people living outside of the country. If you'd like more information on this and you're struggling with your faith or being able to trust the New Testament, I commend to you the great New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. But someone living away from Jerusalem would not have been able to make that up, I don't think. The Gospels are really, again, they're written from different countries, and they're really good at naming villages for not living there. These obscure villages, not the main villages, the obscure villages. And they get their geographical information correct, like how far away it is, traveling distance, and going up to Jericho or down to Jerusalem or those kind of things. There's botanical details in the Gospels that are really interesting. For example, there's a story in the Gospel of Luke about a short man who I've always related to named Zacchaeus, and he wants to see Jesus, so he climbs does anybody remember? Sycamore tree. Now here's what's interesting. There were no sycamore trees in Greece, Italy, or Turkey. But there was sycamore trees in Jericho. And pre-internet, that's kind of a big deal to know. There's another thing that happens over and over again, at least it's happened over a dozen times in my lifetime. And instead of telling you about it, I want to show you about it. This is a CNN clip that's about 8 years old of something that was found in Jerusalem. If you could play that.
Well, a sewage worker gets sent out to fix a broken line, but he ends up unearthing something with spiritual and historical significance. In the process of digging up that line, he hit something besides a pipe. It turns out he stumbled upon an ancient pool under the streets of East Jerusalem. Archaeologists believe it's the pool of Siloam, where, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus healed a blind man. No one was more excited than archaeologist Eli Shukran, who was there when the steps, or rather he was there when the steps to the ancient pool were actually unearthed. He joins me now live from Jerusalem. Eli, tell me what it felt like and what was going through your mind when you saw the steps.
I was exciting. 2,000 years, no one know exactly where is the pool. And now you found it, you touch the stone, you touch the pottery, you touch the coin, and it give you a great feel.
And if you think about the story, you go back to the Gospel of John 9:6-8, and it said, Jesus smeared the mud on the blind man's eyes and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So the blind man went away and washed and came back seeing. Now you say you've discovered this pool. How do you think it's going to change how scholars view the Bible, Eli?
I don't know if it's going to change something, but we know today exactly where it was happened. And we have all the evidence, everything that we know surely that this is the place that we found now.
So this happens all the time, at least in my lifetime. It's happened a lot. Something will fall under suspicion. King Hezekiah wasn't a real person, and then they'll find Hezekiah's throne. And they'll be like, never mind, and they'll just move on to the next thing. I'm serious. This happens all the time. You'll see, around every Easter, around every Christmas, National Geographic, some place like that will do it because we love a kind of conspiracy theory. But here's a good principle for us. Since so much of the Bible's history is verifiable, then the small percentage of stuff that is currently under suspicion right now does not cause me heartburn. Because so many times in recent history, something was thought was untrue, and people lost their faith over this. Like, I can't believe, because King David was an historical figure, and then they find like King David's tunnels, and the whole city of David is 3,000 years old, and they're like, all right, let's talk about some other stuff that's not true. But this has been happening for a long time. Okay, another thing that often comes up, the Gospels were the last thing written in the New Testament, around 30 to 50 years after Jesus' death. Why? And doesn't that show there's got to have been some evolution. You know, Jesus never really said the stuff that he said. Well, why is it written so long after? There's a couple of really good reasons for this. One, I've told you earlier about a guy named Papias from the first century. He was a church leader in the first century, and he said when it came to the stories of Jesus, he preferred the living voice. He's writing around 80 AD. What does he mean? He means the voices of the people who were living, who saw and interacted with Jesus. It is one thing to stand up and read the Gospel of Mark. It is another thing to say, Simon, come here, tell us the story. And that's the option that they had for those first few decades. But as the first eyewitnesses were dying out, the Gospels were written to preserve, just like with the Holocaust deniers, these stories and testimonies of these eyewitnesses. You can see the value placed on eyewitness in the New Testament. Like after Judas dies, when they're going to replace the apostle because they want to be 12 disciples or 12 apostles like the tribes of Israel, when they're going to replace the apostle, they say, here's the criteria. It needs to be someone who was with us from the beginning, who lived among us and saw what we saw. They placed a big value on eyewitness. This is important because the well-known atheist Richard Dawkins, as well as the well-known atheist and New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, both think that what happened, and this is kind of in the air, what happened was Jesus was a great guy, big fan of Jesus, love your work, Jesus, love the Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus never said he was God. Jesus, wouldn't have done that. What happened was a few decades go by, and what Richard Dawkins calls Chinese whispery, I don't think that's offensive in England. In America, it's known as the telephone game. In fact, I actually thought about getting a bunch of kids to do the telephone game to show that to you. Then it seemed a bit like chaos, so I didn't. But you know the telephone game, right? Y'all know this? Like it starts with a message. I would whisper a message to a kid and let him whisper it to another kid. And then at the end of it, I would have said, okay, now what's the message? And we would hear how it evolved. That's a telephone game. And that's what Richard Dawkins says happened with the New Testament. However, like the telephone game, it is true that the stories were passed on by word of mouth. Unlike the telephone game, they were not whispered along a single chain. They were proclaimed in synagogues and marketplaces from house to house. And rather than depending on a single source like that first child, there were thousands of witnesses to Jesus' preaching, his miracles, what he did. Large crowds gathered to hear him teach, and a small band of disciples lived life with him and traveled with him for years. And 12 of them were specifically chosen to pass on exactly what Jesus taught. Like the child who starts the telephone game, they knew firsthand what Jesus said and did. If there's ever any doubt as to what the message is, this first kid can come along and be like, wait, that's actually not what I said, right? That's what the apostles were. That world-class scholar, Richard Bauckham, argues the Gospels were written when they were because the original eyewitnesses were starting to die out. And it's a great book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. He shows that all these characters that are mentioned, like Simon in the Gospel of Mark, that's not just an incidental detail. That's Mark saying, talk to Simon. He actually carried the cross. It's a footnote, it's a flag saying, this guy is alive and you can talk to him. If you don't believe me about this story, ask Mary Magdalene. She saw it with her own eyes. And in John, the Gospel of John, it was written by an eyewitness himself, one of Jesus' apostles. If this is true, the Gospel of John is not like the telephone game at the end. It's like the telephone game at the beginning. It's the original source. So some other reasons I believe in the Gospels I think might be helpful is the internal evidence. Have you ever read the Gospels? They're horrible propaganda. For example, in Mark 3, Jesus is teaching and his family breaks in and it's like they try to take him because they're like, he's lost his mind. His mom does not think he should be teaching because he's like getting too big for his britches, which by the way, I can also relate to that. But yeah, his family doesn't believe in him. This is horrible propaganda. You read through it, and if it's propaganda, then with all due respect, why did the disciples look so dumb? They look like they've been taking stupid pills if you read the Gospels. Seriously. We'll talk about this in a couple of weeks in another series, but The Gospel of Mark broadcast the greatest failure of what is considered the greatest leader in the first church. Peter's failure. Mark wrote that, and guess where he got all his material from? Peter. With all due respect to our Mormon cousins, it took us 200 years to know how many wives Joseph Smith had. We knew this from day one about Peter. Peter's worst failure is not swept under the rug. It's made public. Another thing that I find compelling in the Gospels is what's not in there. The missing sayings. For example, if you're just making this up, the first century church, the biggest controversies they were facing was how Jews and Gentiles can be in the same church. Do Gentiles need to get circumcised? Do they need to follow the law of Moses? And Jesus doesn't say anything about Gentiles getting circumcised. You could have fixed that with just one thing. And this was a big debate by the time Mark was writing his gospel. The letters of Paul are going around addressing exactly this. And Mark doesn't say Jesus says anything about this. Jesus doesn't say anything in the Gospels about, the Trinity or how he could be fully human and fully divine. The questions they were wrestling with at the time. Why? Because the gospel writers were trying to be honest. They didn't think they could make this stuff up. They're wanting to say what really happened. They weren't willing to change or omit something just because it was embarrassing or difficult, or willing to make up something to solve a current church dilemma. So, back to the Da Vinci Code. Here's the story, that in the 4th century, when Constantine becomes a Christian, and he does that for political reasons, that's probably true. He becomes a Christian, and he invents the Bible, basically. He omits all these things, like the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. He creates the Bible. He gets everybody together, all the church leaders, and he's like, look, for political reasons, we've got to have unity, so we've got to get all this stuff together. And he suppresses certain writings that were the real words of Jesus, who was really married or really super liberal or super conservative or really just super whatever the person spreading the rumor is. That's funnier than y'all gave it credit for, but... And people believe this because we like a conspiracy theory. And the best thing I can say is, okay, go and read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Go read Gospel of Thomas. Go read the Gospel of Judas. They ain't the same thing. People weren't dying for those Gospels back in the day because they weren't Gospels. Jesus is petty and mean in the Gospel of Thomas. He's misogynistic. He says the way that women will be saved is by becoming men in the end. He's afraid of girls in the Gospel of Thomas. But people believe it because they love a conspiracy theory. So here's what I want you to know. Since the mid-6th century, the church had all the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Mark. As early as the 80s and 90s, the church was reading every week when they gathered together on Sunday what you now have in your New Testament, called the Gospels. In fact, I'll show you this. This is late 1st century, early 2nd century, a church leader named Justin Martyr. I'll let you guess how he got his last name, writing about their church experience. He says, we gather together, we share our resources, we bless the maker of all things through his son, Jesus Christ, and on Sundays, next slide, on the day called, go back, sorry. On the day, well, you're confusing me too. On the day called Sunday, all who live in the cities and country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles, what you call gospels, or the writings of the prophet are read as long as time permits. Then, when the reader has ceased, the president, which is what they called the preacher, I think we should bring that back, by the way. The president verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things, and then we rise together and we pray. This is a description of what the early Christians' worship was like. The word for what is in your Bible and not in your Bible is the word canon, which is Latin. It just means measuring rod. And when the Christians gathered in the 4th century to formalize the canon, it was an easy job. Because there is a difference between the church recognizing a book as authoritative and giving it authority. And as soon as Apostle wrote a gospel, it was authoritative. I like the way J.I. Packer says it. The church no more gave us the New Testament than Sir Isaac Newton gave us gravity. God gave us gravity. Newton just recognized it. Here's what these Gospels were doing. This is not in the Gospel of Thomas. This is not in the Gospel of Judas. They're doing history. Not modern versions of history, but history, and it's accurate. And here's what Luke is saying. A lot of people undertook to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Why did they take this history so seriously? There's a time in the Gospel of John where Jesus, towards the end of his ministry, is saying, I'm going away. And Philip says this thing that is heartbreaking. It's crushing, because I know every person, atheist, agnostic, religious, non-religious, Christian, non-Christian. It is your heart. It's your deepest desire. It's not fix your marriage, watch out for your kids, get you money. It's not that. Your deepest desire is this question, and your soul can't even enunciate it. But here's the question. He says, if you'll show us the Father, it's the thing beneath all the things. Show us the Father. Show us God. And Jesus turns and looks at him, and this is so powerful. Don't you know me, Philip? After I've been with you all these years, if you've seen me, you've seen God. The invisible has become visible. Anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. This is the way the New Testament was written. The Gospels are like this for the Bible, but not just the Bible, all of life. If you could show this picture, it's kind of cheesy, kind of hokey, unless you've never experienced it, and then you're like, whoa, that's profound. So close your eyes, then barely open them, and look at that. For those on the podcast, good luck figuring this out. It's a picture of Jesus that's kind of hidden. As John Stott says, if anything is clear from the Gospels and the Acts, it was that the apostles were sincere. You may think they were deceived, fine, but they were not deceivers, because hypocrites and martyrs are not made of the same stuff. So in the end of the Gospel of Luke, that carefully historical document, Jesus is risen, and these two disciples are heartbroken because they don't know they're talking to Jesus. They're walking back home after Jesus has been crucified, and normally when people are crucified, they stay dead. And Jesus comes alongside of them, and he's like, what are you talking about? And they tell him about all their heartbreak, and then Jesus opens up this library of books with them. And in Luke 24, he said, how foolish you are. How slow to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them all the scriptures concerning himself. What a Bible study. What does that look like? In light of the resurrection, what do these stories mean? And I can tell you, they come alive like this. Jesus is the new and better Adam, who sweats drops of blood, and his crown is our thorns. Jesus is the new and better Eve, bringing forth his children in unspeakable pain. He's the new and better Cain, banished from the presence of God and marked for death, not life. He's the new and better Abel. His blood speaks a better word, renewing the face of the whole earth. He's the new and better Noah, who does not save himself, but dies with the unrighteous under the flood of God's judgment. He's the new and better Abraham. He is the one righteous man that spares the city of Sodom. Jesus is the better Esau. He tricks us into taking his birthright. He's the new and better Aaron, a high priest who tears open the veil and welcomes all into the presence of God. He's the new and better Rahab, who welcomes everyone into her home. He's the new and better Samson, who saved more of his enemies in his death than in his life. He's the new and better Jonathan, who befriends us and will never abandon us. He's the new and better Saul, who is never jealous of us, but for us. He's the new and better Ark of the Covenant, who when Uzzah touched the ark, it struck him down dead. But when people touched God's presence, it brought his life and his power and his healing. He's the new and better Job. He comforts those who only offer ridicule. He forgives those who sit in judgment over him. He's the new and better Elijah, who didn't just, he gave a sacrifice and it called down the fire of God. But Jesus is the sacrifice and the presence of God. He's the new and better Hosea, who chases after the faithless lover, speaking tenderly to them. He's the new and better Isaiah, who sees the Lord high and lifted up, but not on a temple, outside Jerusalem on a cross. He's the new and better Jonah, who we throw overboard to save ourselves, but death doesn't swallow him. He swallows death. Stand if you believe it.
Is the greatest, your name stands above them all. All thrones and dominions, all powers and positions, your name stands above them all. Your name is the highest, your name is the greatest, your name stands above them all. All thrones and dominions, all powers and positions, your name stands above them all. And the angels cry, oh, holy, all creation cries, oh, holy, you are lifted high, oh, holy forever. Hear your people sing, oh, holy to the King of Kings, and holy you will always be. Holy, holy forever. You will always be holy, holy forever.
He is the heart behind every Bible story. And he wants your heart. I want to invite the prayer teams to take their places around the auditorium. And I want to say this with all love. The problem with the way we read the Bible, I mean our tribe, I mean a lot of Protestants, but our tribe in particular, is we read it for information, not to encounter the living God. And so I want to do that now. I want you to get a chance to see God, to see the Father, to encounter the living Word that became flesh. Jesus is in this room. I mean that sincerely. His power is available for life change to anyone who wants him, to anyone who wants to see God. Just look at him. To anyone who's carrying the weight of life, cast your burdens on him. Jesus is real. We're going to pray and respond and sing, so you can get on your knees and pray. You can lift up your hands and sing. Jesus is real. He can forgive anything, and his forgiveness is real. Choose today to give your life to Jesus in baptism. This is not some overly emotional plea. This is just reality. Jesus is who he says he is. Give yourself to him in baptism. Choose today to give your life to him again. Pray where you are or with the prayer team. Choose today to give your life to him again by singing these words. He's worth it. He's real. He's alive. This stuff really happened. And Jesus is here in this room right now. Let's sing to him, and you can go respond as you need.